Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bod Booker and today I'm doing a tag by the wonderful AJ Dunn Reads and Writes. Sorry, I'm on a spinny chair and I keep on turning as I'm talking. It's a really bad habit. But yes, so AJ Dunn created this tag and I'm really intrigued to check this out. They always have such interesting ideas for tags that kind of take it with a sort of very kind of common theme, and this one, the It's All Relative tag, kind of focuses on sort of families, and I'm a bit of a sucker for sort of family based books anyhow, so really excited to kind of see how this all goes. So first up, I'm sort of reading this off another little phone here, so I'm kind of like a tiny font, so apologies in advance. So the first tag is Mammamia. Recommend a book with a mother character that is pivotal to the story. And there are so many good mothers in books, I find, and I'm always sort of drawn to kind of really strong characters. But I think one that I'm going to choose for this is the mother, and I've forgotten their name now, from Breathing Lessons by Anne Tyler, who is such a sort of meddling character in some ways, always with great intentions, but she's always sort of sticking her nose in some ways, and as a result, so it's almost a bit of a farcical comedy in parts of this book where things keep on going wrong, and it's often kind of attributed to her. I want to say Maggie. I want to say her name's Maggie, she's so funny and so endearing because I feel like I know that woman, and she is sort of so lovingly portrayed. It's kind of something Anne Tyler I think does really well, of presenting a character with all their flaws but being incredibly generous and loving in how she approaches them. And so regardless of us kind of being like, oh, she's a bit of a bother, we kind of love her and we sort of see that she has really great intentions all the way through. I was almost going to use this for the next prompt as well, but for the second prompt, Papa Don't Preach. And this is a father character who you either like or despise. And I'm going to bring in Shakespeare from Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. A gorgeous book. Shakespeare does not necessarily come across well in it. He's a bit kind of flighty and kind of obsessed with his work and a few other things. So I'm not sure whether I necessarily fall on loving him or despising him, but either way, he is kind of a ghost almost in this book. We learn a lot through him and a lot sort of told sort of from his perspective, but always kind of, it always feels like the camera is moving away from him. And in some ways that feels quite intentional because as a result we get this really detailed and layered and rich story of a sort of fairly failed version of fatherhood, but one that I just think is so interesting, because we're sort of meant to be like, oh, but this man is a genius, you know, he's Shakespeare, but actually you kind of forget that, you know, as much as he may be Shakespeare, for people around him, he may have also been that guy who, you know, who owed money like to them, or was, you know, a sort of somewhat absent father. And so I think it's really interestingly done in this book, and we never really get him completely by name. We're kind of, it sort of circled around in a way that I think is really clever. So yeah, really appreciated the gorgeousness of this book, and I just think it's lovely. For the third prompt, we have Brothers and Sisters, so a book with an interesting sibling relationship. And it's probably no surprise in some ways that I'm probably going to talk about Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller. I love this book. This is probably fairly well known for anyone who's sort of watched a few of my videos perhaps, but this book I just think is stunning. So it focuses in on these sort of two twins, brother and sister, who are in their 50s, and suddenly their mother dies, and they have been living with her all of their lives, and in many ways don't really know how to function outside of her, of kind of her sort of supporting them and doing a lot of things for them. And then this plot really unravels and we find out more and more about how they're really not that, a lot's been kept from them. We learn that they're really not that capable of doing some things, but also that they find a lot that they're able to do that they didn't expect. And it's just so beautiful and heartwarming in so many ways. I mean, I think the writing of this is stunning as well, which helps. There's something, I sort of said this a few times, but there is something really physical about this book. When characters feel shame or when there's a threat of violence, you feel it in your bones. It's so painstakingly detailed, and I just think it's brilliant. I just think it's so well done. A gorgeous book, and the sibling relationship at the heart of this book really sells it. I don't think this would work unless we had a really strong sense of how these characters would interact, and that's sort of done so beautifully. There are so many ways that they overlap, and also so many ways that we see this brother and sister so different. You know, the sister being illiterate and really relying on her brother to do other things. They don't have bank accounts. They don't, you know, there are so many things they can't do in society, and it's kind of almost scary how little they're able to do. And I think that's what cranks up some of the tension in this book as well, in such a beautiful and powerful way. The next prompt is It's Been 84 Years. And so this is a book that you like, that is multi-generational and chronicles a character's entire life. And a book that came to mind for this is John Boyne's The Heart's Invisible Furies, which I really enjoyed. And so this chronicles the life of this man in sort of 7-year segments, as he sort of comes to terms with his identity as a gay man, and is sort of searching for his mother. And because we get this sort of every 7 years, there is a real sense where we follow a whole track of his life. We sort of, you know, see him through sort of childhood and teenage years, and sort of we see him as an older man trying to work out what's happening. And I just think this book captures some really gorgeous things. I think as much as parts of it are a little bit, what's the word, like a little bit predictable, like, you know, a little bit circumstantial and kind of coincidental at times, I think the book kind of gets away with it for me because it's so beautifully written, and because we really, I think there's something so interesting about tracing particularly a queer life, but sort of over the course of, you know, every sort of 7 years, because we watch how things like legislation changes, we watch how people's attitudes change, and so there's something really quite interesting about how, you know, we see him at one age completely being hidden and not telling anybody, and we see him at another time going, you know, during the AIDS crisis, and then we also see him in a position where it's legally allowed for him to adopt or marry, and that is really interesting to sort of view over a whole range of time. And I think that's so special, and I think that's a really good use of the multi-generational kind of theme and sort of trope to kind of really chronicle the changing of something nationally as well as internally and personally. And the next prompt, You Complete Me. And so this is a book with an interesting marriage as a central element to the story. And the marriage is sort of, takes a sort of different role in this book to kind of in some ways what you might expect, but Andrew Sean Greer's Less, which I just think is such a fun and beautiful book. So it is a book about this sort of gay man approaching his 50s. He's a sort of moderately successful writer, sort of hasn't really had, well, has had some success, but it's almost a bit embarrassing for him because he'll be invited to things and people will be like, oh, it's him, you know, or who are you? And he basically realizes he's approaching 50, he's sort of recently had a breakup, and he's been invited to this wedding. And he is doing everything he can to avoid going to this wedding. So he thinks, okay, I'm going to say yes to absolutely every book tour and every conference I can speak at and anything. I'm going to do it. I don't care about what I'm actually doing on this. I just need to be busy, partly to keep my mind off things, but also so I have a wonderful excuse to be like, oh, I'm so sorry, I can't make your wedding. I'm really busy and successful and wonderful. And this book, I mean, I loved this. It's so funny and warm, but at the same time, you know, this is a character who is just at the heart of it, really, really struggling for kind of a sense of purpose and identity, and just kind of, you sort of just want to hug him for basically the entire book because he's just sort of flailing a little bit. And what's really special is sort of just thinking, he's sort of doing all this to kind of convince himself he's okay, and you as the reader are like, man, you're all right. But I think it does speak to a very specific kind of thing around LGBTQ people Q plus people and aging, in the sense that some of the milestones of sort of life feel somewhat different, because, you know, for a while marriage and children weren't really on the cards. Lots of people kind of established their own patterns and routines, and sort of landmarks, not landmarks, what's the word I'm thinking of, sort of benchmarks for what makes someone successful or not. And so, whereas, you know, other people might be able to say sort of, you know, well, I'm in my 30s, I'm getting married and having kids, or whatever. For some sort of queer people, that's not, that sort of doesn't fit in quite the same way. And so we're introduced to this character who's in his 50s, and people are kind of settling down and doing other things, and he doesn't quite know where he's at. Is he successful? Is he old? Is he, where does he fit? And I think that's what's so special about this book. And so I think the wedding aspect of this book really amps up that tension, because actually it's a relatively new thing for this character, that kind of LGBTQ people, Q plus people, would be able to be in sort of non-opposite sex marriages, and so as a result, he's quite confused about where he sort of sits, and so this wedding kind of feels like, in some ways, it's not only like impending doom, but also passing judgment on him, because he's now almost feeling like he's out of the loop, he's not kept up. And I think it's so well done, but so funny and so generous with its love for its characters, particularly the main character throughout the book. I just love it. I love it so much. The sixth prompt is Picture It, Sicily. And this is a book with an interesting elderly character, so grandparent, great-grandparent, etc. And I mean, it's a book I've spoken about a little bit recently as well, but I'd say A 5-Year Sentence by Bernice Rubens. So this book is all about this woman who basically is about to finish her job, and the book opens with her wanting to take her own life. Not the cheeriest book, but essentially what she does is she's given, as this sort of leaving gift from her work, a 5-year diary. And she sort of thinks like, oh, well, gosh, like I have to fill it now, don't I? So I have to be at least another 5 more years, alive, another 5 more years. And so what she does is she initially sort of starts by writing about her day, and realizes her days sound utterly boring. And so what she starts doing is challenging herself by writing something in the diary that she'll do the next day. So for example, one of her first ones is sort of about going and asking someone out on a date. And she's sort of like, no, I couldn't possibly do this. And she does it, and she goes out, she secures herself a date. But that date, as we learn, has terrible consequences. And the diary aspect of this book is done so well, because towards the end, she's writing these things that are almost absurd in the diary. There is, I don't want to spoil it, but at one point she writes in the diary, kill him. Or kill, I think it might just be. And there's a real tension, because you're like, well, she's done everything else that's been in the diary. Is she going to kill this person? And it's so cleverly done. And I think it's such an interesting portrayal of this older woman, because actually, you know, in films and TV, we don't often get too much of an interior life of older characters. You get it a little bit more in fiction, but even then sometimes you don't get it too much. And there's something so powerful about watching as this old woman grapples with the meaning of life, with her identity. Does she want to live? What things give her purpose? And are those things really transitory, or are they real and things to say, you know, to stay? Because she's gotten to this point in life and feels there's nothing left living for. So yeah, really interesting book, and I think it does some really, I mean, it's really funny as well as being really dark, and I just think it's so brilliantly written that I just always want to recommend this book forevermore, and I love it. There we go. The next 2 prompts I might squidge together, because I think there's a book that covers them both really interestingly, and that is prompt 7, Friends with Benefits, a book with found family or friends as family element, and prompt 8, I Think We're Alone Now, a book with a character who was lost, left behind, or abandoned. And the book, I don't know if people can predict this from what I was sort of saying, but the book that I think kind of ties these together really well is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Not everybody's favourite book. I adored it. I thought it was really well written and really powerfully done. And this concerns a group of sort of largely sort of 4 friends in New York who are kind of brought together by sort of various things. They are all, I believe, LGBTQ plus, and they kind of share this sort of space all together and sort of look after each other. But when Jude, this sort of character at the heart of the book, who is the one who's sort of been abandoned and has had a really horrendous life in many, many ways, and a life that doesn't get easier, unfortunately, as the book goes on. There's this really gorgeous moment where he, sort of towards the end, after so much suffering and so much pain and descriptions and events in the book that made me just sort of have to sort of stop and just stare at a blank wall for a bit because it broke me. This book is, it's grim, it's hard hitting, and it's pretty dark. But at one point, a character is sort of given Jude is given a new family, not only from his friends, but also, I don't really want to spoil it, but there's a sort of, he's welcomed into another family in some way. And it's so beautifully done that I was, by this point, just, you know, the book had broken me down so much that I was really rooting for this character to sort of find this love and be in this family towards the end. And you just sort of want something to make this sort of pain stop for this character. And I just think it's so interestingly done. Again, I know that lots of people have had issues with it. It's a hard going book. Some people find it a bit exploitative. For me, I kind of feel like it maybe is close to that, but just about works for me. And I just think it's really good. And just it's a lot though. It's a lot. Yeah, I'm also noticing, as a sort of a side thing, that, you know, this sort of is a tag all about families, and I love that I mean, a lot of books I read are sort of LGBTQ plus anyway, but my sort of instinct on a lot of these books when talking about families is to look at kind of LGBTQ families as well. And I think that's something also to say about the fact that this sort of prompt around found family is so interesting, because for a lot of queer people, you know, some people have quite problematic relationships with family, and you know, that's not just the queer community, that's, you know, everywhere, but you know, sort of especially so in some ways for the queer community. And there's something so beautiful about the way that fiction, and some non-fiction, but especially fiction, is able to give us endings and sort of families that sort of can kind of bring together something that we might have felt was missing, or something that we kind of wish we had, or kind of tie up some loose ends or around kind of conversations on those things as well. So I think really interestingly done there. Yeah, and just I think some books do that really well. I think The Blackwater Lightship is a book I've not mentioned in this as well, by Con Tobin, and that for me has this sort of family dynamic so powerfully done. It's so interesting because these characters, there are so many misunderstandings, and these kind of characters all don't really get on and know each other and understand things, and in the middle of it there's also an HIV diagnosis, and the way that characters deal with each other and cope is just so powerful. And yeah, I just think you know, I just think it's just done beautifully, and really sells that family aspect in such a new and exciting way for me. And for the final prompt, which is called Fur Babies, I thought I would let Annie have a little bit of a wonder, because I feel like this is very appropriate. So this is a prompt all about books that have kind of dogs, well, not dogs necessarily, although Annie is maybe sort of vying for that, that have animals as sort of part of the family. And so, although there are some other really good examples, one that kind of keeps on coming to mind, just because, I mean, they're sort of less part of the family and more part of yourselves, but I think the animals, or all of the kind of the demons, I suppose they, let's say, from his Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman, I just think are done really interestingly, because there's such a connection, because they are sort of part of the soul, come on Annie, that makes them really quite appealing, because there's a really in-depth relationship between this animal, this sort of demon, or daemon, I'm never quite sure how that's meant to be pronounced actually, and the kind of character themselves. It's come on, Annie. She's not long eaten as well, so I'm getting all of that dinner smell all over my face, which is lovely. Thank you. but there's something so powerful about the way that the animals sort of have these relationships, and there's something so stunning about the way that it's introduced that at one point Lyra, one of the sort of central characters, well, the central character, she has to sort of be, she's just sort of dropping her dog, her little bone treat now. Come on. Distraction for a split second. But there's a moment where they have to be parted, and it's so brilliantly done because you really feel this sort of destructive element, sort of something being torn away from her, and her having her heart ripped out, basically, in a real sense of loss. And we get this period of sort of across a few other books where they she's literally rolling around on her back over there, like showing her belly. No cares in the world. I love dogs. They're so pure. What did we ever do to deserve them? But yeah, you feel this sort of this sense of them being sort of this heart being ripped out of them, this kind of almost disconnection from the soul. And we spend a whole sort of book or two with Lyra and Pantalaimon, her demon, not talking really and not really understanding each other. And for, you know, they'd previously had this sort of strong sort of psychic connection almost, where they kind of hear each other's thoughts and they know exactly what the other one's thinking. And to watch these two characters be so distant from each other is so beautiful and powerful, and really stayed with me. And so I'd say that for them. Plus, I can't remember now exactly off the top of my head what they're called, but they're these kind of really interesting sort of horse, elephant, bizarre kind of creatures in the books that are sort of shaped sort of almost like a four-wheeled elephant, but kind of in the shape of a diamond. And they're kind of created so interestingly. You know, they use these sort of pods to sort of wheel themselves around, sort of like these sort of elephants sort of crossed with a Harley Davidson. And it's sort of so fantastical and brilliant, and I also just love them and want to talk about them as well. Anyway, but this has been a wonderful, wonderful tag by AJ Dunn Reads and Writes, as usual. They come up with some really interesting and thought-provoking prompts. And I'm going to tag a few people now. So I'm going to tag the wonderful couple over at Shelf Possessed, who are brilliant and well worth checking out. Really, really interesting. Really, really interesting people, and I think, well, yeah, just always fun to hear their thoughts. Larry over at Larry Has Opinions. He has opinions. They are mostly brilliant. They're all brilliant. So go and check him out, and check out his Discord as well. It's really interesting and really fun. I'd also say Indian Cooks and Books, who is really interesting, some really, really great thoughts. And I'd also say Ms. Reads a Lot, who is also really fun, and I'd love to hear her thoughts on this too. Anyway, that's been me doing this prompt. Annie is now fully gearing up for a walk, which I'm going to go and take her on, and I'm very excited about that. I've been Bob the Booker, so take care and see you all soon. Bye.